Welcome to part 7 of the New South and the Wild West. Now we're going to take a look at precious metals in the West. In 1893, a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner issued a thesis that was based on the 1890 census, in which he said that the frontier was closed. This is referred to as the frontier thesis. In this thesis, he said that the frontier process had been completed and that the virgin land of the continental United States had been occupied by mostly immigrants moving into the area, right? Now, even today, this is still a pretty hotly debated topic, but one thing is for certain, there certainly was a concerted effort by the government to try and get people to move into those open areas in the West. For example, during the Civil War, the North wanted Northerners to move into these open areas, mostly so that Southerners didn't and therefore would make a possible claim on it for the Confederacy. Believe it or not, there was actually at one point, and you can find maps of this, a North and South Arizona, according to the Confederate claims anyways, right? And so they issued the Homestead Act of 1862. This act would allow you to buy 160 acres of land in the West, or get it for free. You could get it free of charge, provided that you lived on it for 5 years and made improvements on it. And then they don't define what improvements are. I mean, improvement, it could be almost anything. Build one windmill and you're done, right? If you wanted to go ahead and take the purchase option, you would just move out there for 6 months, and then after that you could buy it for $1.25 per acre, which was pretty darn cheap, right? Now, unfortunately, because it's 160-acre plots, a quarter square mile, that's too small for any really decent farming or for building large ranches, and so it actually encouraged land speculators who were buying up land that they anticipated would become the next population centers as the populations moved westward, right? In 1877, you'll have the passage of the Desert Lands Act. This was designed to try and encourage people to move into the more arid regions of the United States, like the American Southwest. You could buy that land in allotments of 640 acres, 1 square mile, at 25 cents an acre. They would give you the title in 3 years, provided that you irrigated the land in that time frame. And then they didn't define what irrigation meant. What did that mean? You could go out there, buy 1 square mile of land, pee on a bush, and there you go. You got it. You irrigated it. Okay. Now, despite these efforts, a large portion of the western lands remained unoccupied, and even into the 20th century, because a lot of people that moved west would move into cities, right? As a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting that the West, on a per capita basis, was actually more urban than the East Coast was, right? In the East Coast, you have a lot of people in rural areas. The people that moved west tend to congregate in places like Denver and San Francisco, Los Angeles, even Salt Lake City, whose populations would explode. But the people that moved out west came from a vast variety of different backgrounds, right? It was truly a melting pot in the West as far as immigration goes, because you had, well, first you had the populations that were already there. You had the Native American populations and, of course, the Hispanic populations that had been there because of the Spanish ownership of the region previous to this time. But you also had, of course, you had the European settlement from as Americans moved in the region, and then you also had exodusters. These were former slaves who decided that they weren't going to put up with Jim Crow laws and just move west instead. That's one way to get away from segregation, is just to move west. And then you also had Asian immigration, predominantly Chinese immigration. So it truly was a vast variety of different groups. So what drove the economy here in the West? Well, one big portion of the economy driving in the West was surrounding precious metals. On January 24th, 1848, a man named James W. Marshall was kicking around at a place called Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. He was down by the riverbed when he saw something shiny, and like all of us, we went, ooh, shiny, right? Picked it up. It was a gold nugget. Okay, this is what is going to be the beginning of the gold rush into California. Now, I know this is 1848, and you're probably wondering, so wait a minute, 48? I thought these guys would be called the 49ers. Well, don't think for a second that James Marshall didn't try and keep this whole thing secret. but by the following year, everyone pretty much knew. And you're going to have people just pouring into California in the California gold rush. How bad is it? Well, let me give you an example. San Francisco is going to explode in size. In 1850, when the Compromise of 1850 made California a state, they cut off the size of the border of California to coincide with the known population inside the state. There needs to be a minimum of 60,000 people in an area for it to apply for statehood. If they had known how many people were in just San Francisco by 1850, you could have made San Francisco at least 3 states, right? Just the city itself, right? And it continued to blossom around California and the outlying areas from there. Like, for example, Nevada. In Nevada, Henry Comstock is going to be a prospector that's going to be taking care of a claim made by brothers Evan and Hosea Grosh. When they died, he inherited this little tiny gold mine. Now, he sold this gold mine because he wasn't really making very much money off of it, but that's because he kept running into this blue slag that he kept having to throw out with it. The investors that bought the mine knew what it was. This guy was literally throwing away silver to get to the small vein of gold, and he was unwittingly mining the largest single silver strike in American history. Well, the people that bought the Comstock lode, as it became known, knew exactly what they were looking at, and at least Henry Comstock got to keep his name on the discovery, right? Now, so you're going to have this massive gold rush in California and in western Nevada in the 1840s, early 1850s, and then finally in the late 1850s, you're also going to have a gold rush in Colorado, right? In 1858, gold will be discovered near Pikes Peak in Colorado, and you're going to have the Pikes Peak Gold Rush or the Colorado Gold Rush, right? So like in California in 1859, you're going to have over 100,000 prospectors descend into Colorado, are 59ers. Well, okay, maybe that's not a good name, but I mean, can you imagine that if we had the San Francisco 49ers, why not the Denver 59ers? But I got a feeling there's a reason why that didn't ever happen. So gold and silver is going to dominate a lot of the economies in the West, but it's not the only precious metal that's going to be important. Copper, for example, especially in the American Southwest. In 1870, 2 Army officers, Jim and Robert Metcalf, were part of an Army expedition that were chasing Apache resistance leaders Victorio and Geronimo. And in the process, Jim and Robert saw a hill down here in what is now southern Arizona, that was so covered in copper that it was literally that greenish oxidized copper color. And so they very quickly and wisely staked a claim on it. However, they couldn't do anything with that claim because, well, they're attached to the Army, and mining is a very expensive proposition, really. It's not something that, honestly, individual prospectors tended not to get rich. It's these companies that will move in afterwards that will. So Jim and Robert Metcalf sold their claim to a guy named Henry Lisinski. And Henry Lisinski is going to, in 1873, found the Longfellow Copper Mining Company and began mining copper here in southern Arizona, right? This mining operation on the border with Mexico is going to be huge, and copper is going to be really important because think about it. Copper is used for telegraph lines and then eventually later on electricity lines. It's used for a lot of different things, and so copper is going to become more and more important, and so these mines are as well. One interesting side note to this is that the borders down there were pretty open. There's no wall down there, and there's no consideration for one. Let me put it that way. Okay, so you're going to have people from Mexico coming up and working in the American copper mines, and you're also going to have Americans that are going to go south and work in the copper mines that are on the Mexican side of the border. It's a pretty open format. Matter of fact, by 1900, Mexican nationals made up 60% of the mining and seasonal farm workers in the West because of this open border strategy. This is something that's not going to start really getting closed up and be putting down on until after World War II. Now, an important thing to remember here is that mining is corporate. right? It really is. I mean, we can romanticize about the prospector going out there and striking it rich, panning for gold, but it doesn't take very long before that river gold disappears. It dries up. And then you got to find where that gold's getting into the river. And once you found it, then you got to dig. You got to start building mine shafts like the one in this picture. And if you're digging mine shafts, that takes a lot of resources and capital. Mining is corporate. The prospectors didn't get rich. It was for the corporations did, right? Prospectors, mine workers became wage earners, right? And working in a mine, any mine, was a pretty dangerous process, a dangerous task, and it didn't necessarily pay very well. For example, in Colorado in 1882, an average miner worked 60 hours per week and made only $2.50 per day, and that was actually pretty good. Because when you compare it, for example, in Pennsylvania, in the coal mines, an average coal miner made $1.35 per day, right? But again, you also got to take into account that these are gold and silver boom towns. There's also rampant inflation in these areas. For example, in San Francisco, I know we talked about the stereotype of the Chinese laundry. In San Francisco, there were Chinese laundries, right? Chinese immigrants worked in service industries, and it was actually at the peak of the gold rush, it was actually cheaper to take your laundry, box it up, put it on a boat, send it to Shanghai in China, have it washed and brought back. That was cheaper than taking it to the local laundry in Chinatown, right? Now, because this is wage laboring now and corporations involved, you're also going to see labor unions get involved as well. Labor unions will begin to form to try and help with the plight of the miners, right? Because mining is so dangerous. Okay, the Western Federation of Miners was formed in 1893 in order to try and help protect these miners that are out here in the West and elsewhere that are digging up these precious resources out of the ground.